think you're in for a real treat tonight. Dr. Ostrich is, first of all, he's a World War II veteran. He's a veteran of the Pacific, but he's not going to tell us about his exploits in the Pacific. He has had a long career and a distinguished career. He's worked for many government agencies. He's traveled around the world. He spent several years in Vietnam doing, I don't know what he was doing there. I think it was secret. But for the last 20 or 25 years, he was teaching at Northern Virginia Community College. He's taught almost every course they have at Northern Virginia Community College, although he's retired now. But Dr. Ostrich is a scholar. He's thoroughly read. He has a library that would be impressive for any institution, which he has in his home. And he really knows his European history, and he knows Austria, and he knows Russia, and he knows the people involved and all the personalities. So the lecture you're going to get tonight is going to really take you beneath the surface. We've been skimming the surface. He's going to go beneath the surface and show you the nuts and bolts of what is really going on. Dr. Ostrich is going to explain the poisonous atmosphere between these two great powers, why they both chose to push to the limit their varying ideas on Serbia and risk war. They didn't do it just because they felt like doing it or because it just occurred to them, but there's a long history between these two powers, and a lot of things had happened to bring them to that point where they went to war in 1914. Then in going to war, we see the alliance system kick in, and we see all the nations of Europe going to war. So with that, I must say it's my pleasure to turn over the class to Dr. Ralph Ostrich.
The title of this lecture ought to be a love-hate relationship, sort of very Freudian, if you will, a love-hate relationship, and how two nations can love and hate each other and end up destroying each other. They did it unconsciously, and they did it consciously. It's one of those stories that Shakespeare would have loved to have put together. And I'm sure if he had lived long enough, he probably would have. The story starts with 1725 of Peter the Great and his wife, who was not much to say about, becomes the Empress of Russia, of all things. And she's a woman who made very much of herself for lack of brains or anything else one could say. But what she did do is she hired a very smart German who was a friend of her husband's named Osterman, O-S-T-E-R-M-A-N, a German of a very elite German family of such, and he ends up being her foreign minister. And why are we going to mention Osterman? You may be the only folks in this campus who will know anything about him, unless Dr. Bukowski puts him in your exam. But Osterman does one thing. He has the idea of the great plan of how Russia can now be a great power in the European theater. Because prior to Peter the Great, Russia was a backward nation, hardly on the minds of anyone as one of the great powers, such as Great Britain, France, Austria, Hungary, even the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Sweden, and so on and so forth. And Osterman figures out the way that Russia can move forward is to push the Ottoman Empire out of the territories and lands that the Russians ought to and should have in the future. Now this is 1525, rather 1725, that we're talking about. So Osterman has a great idea that Russia and Austria should be allies, very closely linked together, because each of them has one common enemy, and that is the Ottoman Empire, as you see over here. If Turkey could be destroyed, the Russians would have access into the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So Russia would have her future in the southern part of Russia. That would take another 50 years when we get to Catherine the Great in a few moments. But Osterman has enough of a future wisdom to think that. And so somewhere around 1728, an alliance is made between Austria and Russia. Alliance that will more or less find the Russians on the tail of the Austrian dog, as it will. And for everything that the Russians would pay in price and in money and in lives, the Austrians would, for the most part, take advantage of and leave the Russians holding the bag. And that's why I call it the love-hate relation, because that love of the two nations eventually, in 200 and some odd years later, will turn to a bitter hatred and will be one of the causes of the origins of World War I. How could you go from there to here? Very simple. Both nations, both Russia and Austria, in many ways were very weak nations. They had powerful armies, but they had serious financial problems, serious problems with their population. Perhaps the greatest of all is, for Austria and to some extent Russia, the minority problem. That will be a weakness that will show up later on. The problem here is, to begin this story, and since Harry says we have about an hour, we can't spend too much time on the beginning. Suffice it to say that Russia, with her future lady empress, the Empress Anna, who would succeed Catherine II, Peter's wife, and later on Catherine the Great, Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, Peter the Great's daughter, and Catherine the Great. So for 75 years or so, Russia was run by a bunch of women, none of them to compare with Catherine. Elizabeth's pretty good. She knew how to manipulate. Anna, well, her reputation was such that we needn't go further into that. If you want to know a lot about Anna, you'll have to look it up somewhere else. But she lasted from 1730 until 1740. And Osterman was not only her foreign minister, he was also her close confidant, and all of the stuff you might guess going on there. But when Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1740 as Peter's daughter, she has one thing in mind. A, she hates her husband, and she's going to get rid of that guy one way or other, which she will do. Two, she has an idea that she wants to get rid of the Germans running the Russian court. So she gets rid of Osterman and whatever and sends them off to Siberia. That's the way you did things there. Now, having said all that, Elizabeth as empress decides she would hang on to Austria. The problem here is that the European balance of power, which is what Europe is now based on around 1740. Now, as I'm talking these years, 1740, bear in mind that this is a time when our colonies here in North America, the American colonies, were just forming and just getting used to the idea of opposing George III of England, their English colonies, and so already there's a spark of desiring to go their way as the colonies could do, of course, for the next 20 or 30 years, and the next thing you know will be the war of the American Revolution. Now, I mention this only to give you a sense of the historical time that we're talking about. Because one thing for sure, most of students, and believe me, after 28 years at Nova and here at Mason, most students have no idea of time, of the temporal fact. They couldn't tell you who came first, George the First or George the Second. You ask me, I don't know. Well, yeah, believe it or not, that's true. I asked him one time on the quiz, and half of them got it wrong. Okay, now, having said that, but this will give you an idea of where we are, what the contemporary world was like. It was a world of balance of power, that England would be on one side, and wherever England was, and opposed to England was France. Austria would be on one side, and opposed to Austria would also be France. So therefore, England and Austria were friends, or close friends, or whatever, or alliances, or dynastic alliances. You got all that stuff mixed into here. And so in that mishmash there, you have Russia. So the Russians are now going to slowly involve themselves in the politics of Europe. And at this time, France is under the control of Louis XV, and later on his grandson Louis XVI, who had the unfortunate problem of getting involved with Marie Antoinette and all of those horrible things of the French Revolution. So that's giving you some sense of idea of where we are in history. And so for the first time, the Russians are getting themselves involved with the great powers. With the rise of Russia as a great power is the decline of Sweden as a great power, but also the rise of a new little nation made of a bunch of German states that managed to put themselves together, which we call Prussia. So here by 1740 is a good starting point here, for it's a time when Elizabeth becomes Empress of Russia. But at the same time that Elizabeth becomes Empress of Russia, the King of Prussia dies, and his young son, Frederick, becomes King of Prussia. We know him as Frederick the Great. So 1740 is that year when propitious things happen. And this is the thing about history that is interesting, if some of you are interested, is to find out these great moments of history when there is revolution, both on the diplomatic, on the economic, on the scientific, on the whatever, religious, and so on and so forth. So 1740 is a great year of revolution. And when Frederick the Great becomes King of Prussia, Prussia is a backward state, only having a good army. Now, why do I talk about Prussia? Because for one simple reason. Frederick the Great realizes in order for Prussia to have anything more than pigs and beets, they need to be part of the Industrial Revolution. In order to be part of the Industrial Revolution, they need coal, they need iron, they need minerals, they need that. Prussia has none of it. Who's got it? Austria, in Silesia. The Silesian coal mines, or iron mines in Silesia. So Frederick the Great's got a brilliant idea. What I got to do is take it from her. She's a woman. Now, at the same time in 1740, not only does Frederick the Great become King of Prussia, but the King of Austria, the Emperor of Austria, Charles VI, ups and dies. And he has a young daughter named Maria Theresa. And Maria Theresa, 18-year-old young lady, becomes the Empress of Austria. This is a problem for the Emperor Charles VI before his death. All of the nations, the great powers of Europe, England, France, and so on, and Spain, and so on and so forth, have to recognize his daughter as the empress and not to grab all pieces of Austria. And they all agree and sign a concordance that they will respect the blood, and he pays them all off. So Maria Theresa becomes the Empress of Austria. No sooner does she sit herself on the throne, Frederick the Great comes in and invades Austria and takes hold of Silesia and annexes it. The Germans seem to have that habit, which they of course picked up later on, even to an extent far more than we needed to talk about now. But the important thing is, why Russia? Well, the Russians are now involved with Austria as a friend and ally, and Elizabeth is the Empress now of Russia, and her good friend is Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria. And they find out this Frederick the Great is one heck of a nuisance, to say the least, and we've got to get rid of that pest. So the 7 Years' War, the War of the Austrian Succession breaks out between 1740 and 1748. And in that war, very simply put, the Austrians get pretty well beat. The Russians don't do much to help the Austrians because at this point Russia doesn't really have a great army, yet their friend and ally is getting beaten and loses Silesia and cannot win the war, and the war is over by 1748. The Russians haven't done much for their beloved ally, the Austrians. Now, one can argue, does this set in the mind of the Austrians that the Russians are not to be trusted? Because only 30-some-odd years earlier they signed this love pact. Well, it didn't work out too well. But the Russians don't give up, the Austrians don't give up, the French don't give up, the English don't give up. So by 1756, there's another war. Now, in that interim of the war, by 1756, the American colonies, by the way, are beginning to get a little bit more talkative and beginning to push North America toward themselves. That is getting rid of the French in Canada. So in America, what turns out to be the French and Indian War taking place over here is another big war going on in Europe. This time, Austria becomes an ally of France. England now becomes an ally of Prussia. It's a very complicated story to tell. We won't go into that. But that is called the Diplomatic Revolution. And in that diplomatic revolution of where the old alliances change sides, and that is Austria and France now become allies instead of enemies. They've been since 1480s, now in the 1750s, they're friends. Britain, now that was an enemy of Prussia, is now an ally of Prussia. So the sides are switched. Well, the important thing here is to understand that the Austrian-Russian alliance is still holding fast. The women really are supporting each other. If ever there was a time in history that you had women empresses who really liked each other, they really supported, it was kind of a woman's world. It's almost a world of the future to be seen. It's like Hillary being in love with Ms. Merkel, or something like that today. Although I think yeah, we won't go into that. But the point here is to understand that this Russian-Austrian relation is still holding fast. And it holds fast because they both hate Frederick the Great. And they think he's just awful. And the letters written back and forth about what are we going to do about Frederick the Great, you know, the fact that Frederick the Great, as being who he is, has a pretty good army. He has an army that finally, during this 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763, the Austrians and the Russians are finally beginning to beat up on Frederick. everything looks great. Austria and Russia were, in fact, they take Berlin in 1762. And there's an Austrian and Russian army in Berlin, and Frederick is done away with, except that, as they believe. As they believe, he's headed for hell and going to burn there, as they think he is. But one problem, Catherine has a husband. I can't talk too much about Catherine the Great. Most of you are too young to know the whole story about Catherine. So if you want to know about Catherine, I suggest there are several good books about her. Professor Butowski will write a note that you can read that book. It used to be, if you were under 18, you couldn't read about Catherine But I think the Supreme Court says you can be 18 and read any book you want. The First Amendment, I think, works. Needless to say. But the problem here is this. Catherine is like a black widow spider, the big female. And if you know anything about spiders, the male to the black odor is a skinny little weakling. And, you know, he has one thing to do, and that is to make her lay eggs, and then she ends up eating them up. Well, that's like the relationship between Catherine and her husband Peter III. So what she does is, or what Peter does, he's in love, actually. He loves Frederick the Great. He adores him. Now, this is not a homosexual or any of that. He just admires Frederick. Whatever it is, he admires him. But what he does, he pulls the Russian army on the verge of victory in Berlin. And Frederick, they're ready to throw him to the wolves. He pulls the Russian army out, and Frederick survives. And for Catherine and the Russian army, the generals, I mean, they're furious, outraged, whatever. So she works out something with her favorite regiments and whatever, and the next thing you know, in his sleep or somewhere, poor Frederick is strangled. So works for Frederick. She becomes empress. Now, so what? So plenty. Because when she becomes empress, this solidifies her relationship with Austria, and with the purpose of one thing, they are going to do their best to destroy the Ottoman Empire. Well, they start a series of wars, they being the Russians. The Austrians get involved, but at the nick of time, the Austrians pull out. So whereas in 20 years earlier, the Russians didn't do much to help the Austrians in the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 48, the Austrians do very little to help the Russians. So the Russians are stuck fighting this war all themselves. So here you see a pattern establishing itself. If the Russians are winning, and victory is practically theirs, the Austrians pull out, the Russians are left holding the bag and have to sign. Vice versa, if the Austrians are winning, the Russians pull out, and the Austrians are left holding the bag. But this is a wonderful relationship of sorts. It's for attack. And very rarely in the history of nations as we've seen this kind of an events going on between Russia and Austria. It's really an incredible thing to see. But what happens here is that Catherine's armies prove victorious. She finally puts together a military force that beats the Ottoman Empire, which is already on the decline. But it's in those wars between 1772 1773, 1789, a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire, that the Russians gained an enormous amount of territory in the south along the Black Sea, that area we call the Ukraine, which Mr. Putin seems to be getting it back together again once more. So, well, we've been there. And so there you have, Russian Empire begins to push southward into the Black Sea, and they conquer the Crimean, and they being the Russians, and so not only do they get the Ukraine, they get the Crimean Peninsula. They get not only the Crimean Peninsula, but they get themselves one big headache. And that headache is the entrance into the European diplomatic world of the Eastern question. This is one of the things that every professor loves to ask his students. Discuss the Eastern question and write about it, know about it. Now, why is this an important thing? One has to know a little bit about the geographic area of what is now Istanbul, then being Constantinople, which then was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Have any of you been to Istanbul? Well, from Istanbul, you can look across the straits and you can see Asia. Out of the 8th floor of the Hilton Hotel. Trust me, you can do that. There, you can see the water. Now there's a bridge. Now, this is important. Geography has not been good to Russia. Most of Russia is north of the 50th latitude. It's always cold, and blah, 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 blah. Worse yet, it took Peter the Great finally to establish St. Petersburg, where he is back in the war in 1705 against Sweden. So St. Petersburg is established far north of either the most northern part of the United States outside of Alaska. So for those of you who've been to St. Petersburg, formerly known as Leningrad, and so on and so forth, it's cold up there in the winter. And it's not the best of places to be, but it's better, it is located geographically on the inland and outlet into the Baltic Sea. But for the Russians, this is not good enough because mostly it's frozen ice during the winter. So what Russia needs is a warm water port, a port that gets her into the Mediterranean. And into the Mediterranean, her trade and economics, and she could sell her wheat from now the newly acquired Ukraine. She built a great port right on the border of the old Turkish border called Odessa. So Odessa becomes a great grain port for Russia. So from an economic point of view and strategic, Catherine is called the Great because she conquers all that for Russia. But there was a problem, and that is this. The English, all of a sudden, find themselves not in a happy situation. Now, the question is, why would England care about Russia, and Russia wanting to go into the Mediterranean and become a Mediterranean sea power, trade power? Anybody would guess? England has acquired an empire. The jewel of the English empire is India. How does one get from England to India? You have to study a map and see. You get on a boat, you go through the Straits of Gibraltar, you go eastward for 1,000 miles, you come to a place called Suez. Suez is a narrow strip of lakes and land, and you unload the ships at the northern tip at Port Suez, and it goes for 100 miles south, then you reload the ships and you go to India. It's an awkward way of doing it. 100 years later, one of the great English statesmen by the name of Benjamin Disraeli is going to solve that problem. We'll get to that in a moment. But what Catherine has done, is to move into waters that he or she did not realize that the English want the Mediterranean as theirs, as almost an English lake. And the Royal Navy would control it. Why? To protect the roads to India.